The warning came through emergency channels that had not been used since the founding of the Galactic Concord. A desperate transmission from Thixan rebels, who had intercepted the activation codes for a weapon that most species had believed was only a legend. Admiral Park. Commander Shin reported with urgency, barely contained beneath her professional composure. We have confirmed the planet killer is real, and it has begun charging for a hyperspace jump. Park studied the tactical data flooding across his display, and felt the weight of command pressing down on him with a force that threatened to crush his carefully maintained calm. How long until it can fire? He demanded. 14 hours from jump completion, Shin replied. And based on its trajectory, it will emerge from hyperspace within striking distance of Earth. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. The human fleet could intercept the planet killer, but doing so would require abandoning the blockade positions that had taken 6 months to establish if they left to defend Earth. Vorath's loyalist forces would have time to regroup and crush the rebellion before it could succeed. We cannot do both, Shin said quietly, voicing the calculation that every officer on the bridge had already made. Park closed his eyes for a moment and thought of General Yoon, of the lessons she had taught about choosing between terrible options when there was no path that led to victory without cost. Set course for Earth, he ordered, and his voice did not waver even as the words sealed the fate of the careful strategy they had built over half a year of patient discipline. All ships. Maximum speed. We defend our home on the Thixan homeworld. Ambassador Quan Myre fought through burning streets alongside Sub-Commander Vrax and his rebel forces as civil war erupted across the capital. Vorath's loyalists were outnumbered but desperate, fighting with the ferocity of those who knew that surrender meant the end of everything they believed in. The palace is ahead. Vrax shouted over the sound of weapons fire and collapsing buildings. If we can reach the prelate before he escapes, we can end this. Myre ducked behind a shattered wall and returned fire with the plasma pistol that felt wrong in her hands. A diplomat's weapon used by a diplomat forced to become something else. She thought of Sayajin, of the woman who had spent her life avoiding exactly this kind of violence, and wondered if her mentor would forgive her for what she was doing in the name of honoring her memory. Move, Vrax commanded, and they surged forward through the rubble toward the fortress where Vorath waited with his remaining guards. The fighting was brutal and close. Thixan against Thixan in corridors that had been built for ceremony rather than combat. Myre saw rebels fall and loyalists die and tried not to count the bodies as they pushed deeper into the heart of Thixan power. They found Vorath in his throne room, surrounded by the last of his faithful, and preparing to board a shuttle that would take him to a hidden ship beyond the reach of human or rebel forces. You cannot escape, Vrax declared, his weapons trained on the prelate who had led their people to the edge of extinction. Your fleet is scattered. Your planet killer will fail, and your people have chosen to reject your vision of endless war. Vorath made the clicking sound that served as Thixan laughter, but there was no humor in his compound eyes. My planet killer will not fail, he said with the certainty of someone who had already accepted their own ending. The humans have abandoned their blockade to save their precious Earth, which means they will not be here to protect you when my loyalists rally and destroy this pathetic uprising. And even if I die today, I will die knowing that their homeworld burns and their soft philosophy of mercy and restraint burns with it. Myre stepped forward, her weapon lowered, but her voice carrying the authority of everything she represented. Surrender. Vorath, she said, face trial for what you have done, and let your people have a chance to build something better than the empire of cruelty you tried to create. Surrender. Vorath spat the word like a curse. You humans speak of surrender as though it is something other than the death of everything that makes a warrior. He raised his own weapon, not at Myre or Vrax, but at his own thorax. "I will not give you the satisfaction of your pathetic tribunal," he declared. "I will die as a warrior should, and my legacy will live on in the ashes of your homeworld." "No," Myrae said, and she moved faster than she had ever moved in her life, crossing the distance between them and knocking the weapon away before Vareth could pull the trigger. Her guards and Vrax's rebels swarmed the Loyalists, overwhelming them through sheer numbers before anyone else could die. Vareth struggled against the restraints they placed on him, clicking and screaming curses that the translator rendered into strings of hatred and contempt. "You deny me even this," he raged. "You will not kill me, and you will not let me die with honor." Myrae looked down at the creature who had murdered her mentor and felt the temptation to answer his cruelty with cruelty, to prove that humans could be just as savage as any other species when pushed beyond their limits. Instead, she spoke the words that General Yoon had taught her, the words that defined what humanity had chosen to become. "You expected us to be monsters," she said quietly. "You expected us to burn your world as you burned our general, to answer violence with violence until nothing remained but ashes and hatred. We chose differently. Not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to know that some victories cost more than they are worth." She gestured for the guards to take him away, then turned to Vrax. "The blockade is down, and your people need food and medicine more than they need another battle," she said. "Get your government functioning and reach out to the Coalition for humanitarian assistance." "What about the planet killer?" Vrax asked. And even in that moment of victory, there was fear in his voice. "That is not your problem anymore," Myrae replied. "That is ours, above Earth." The human fleet emerged from hyperspace and found the planet killer already powering its main weapon, a vast construct of ancient technology that dwarfed even the largest human vessels. Commander Shin had spent the entire journey calculating options and discarding them, searching for some strategy that would not require sacrifice and finding none. "The weapon will fire in 40 minutes, she reported to Admiral Park. "Our conventional weapons cannot penetrate its shields before then." "Then we use unconventional methods," Park replied, his voice steady despite the certainty of what he was about to order. "Tactical analysis has identified a vulnerability in its hyperspace drive," Shin continued. "But exploiting it requires delivering a synchronized gravitational pulse at close range." "How close?" Park asked, already knowing the answer. "Inside the shield perimeter," Shin said. "Which means the delivering vessels will not survive the weapon's destruction." Silence fell across the bridge as every officer understood what was being asked. "I need 2 destroyer crews willing to volunteer for a one-way mission," Park said finally before he could finish speaking. Every destroyer captain in the fleet had already transmitted their willingness to go. He chose the Defiant and the Unbroken, ships whose crews had served together since the early days of the expansion and who had always known that their oaths might someday require the ultimate sacrifice. Captain Baek Ji-wo of the Defiant spoke for both crews as they accelerated toward the planet killer. "Admiral, it has been an honor to serve under your command and alongside every human who chose to remember who we are. Tell the galaxy what happened here today, and make sure they understand that we did this not because we were unafraid, but because some things are worth dying for." The 2 destroyers punched through the shield perimeter at velocities that should have been impossible, their crews working in perfect synchronization as they delivered the gravitational pulse that would save their homeworld. The planet killer's hyperspace drive destabilized, and the ancient weapon tore itself apart in a cascade of energy that lit up the space around Earth like a second sun. The Defiant and the Unbroken vanished in that light, along with the men and women who had chosen to give everything so that others could live. 1 year later, the memorial stood in the plaza where General Yoon Sojin had died, a simple structure of white stone bearing her final words in 100 languages. "Remember who we are. General Quan Murray, newly appointed to the position that her mentor had held before her, stood before the memorial and addressed the gathered delegates of every species in the Galactic Concord. "We could have destroyed them," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza where Thixan representatives stood among the audience that had come to witness this moment. "We had the power. We had the justification, and we had every reason to answer cruelty with cruelty. We chose differently, not because we are better than other species, but because we believe that strength without restraint is just another form of weakness." She turned to face the spot where Seojin had died, where flames had consumed the body of a woman who had spent her life building bridges between enemies. "General Yoon taught me that the hardest war is the one you fight against your own rage, and that is the only war worth winning. Today we remember her not with vengeance, but with the mercy she believed in. And we prove to the galaxy that humanity can be trusted not just with power, but with the wisdom to use it well." In his cell on a human prison station, Vorath watched the broadcast. The Galactic Concord station hung like a jewel against the endless black of space, its rotating rings catching the light of 3 distant suns and casting prismatic shadows across the docking bays where ships from 100 worlds waited in careful formation. General Yoon Seo-jin stood at the viewport of the human transport vessel and watched the station grow larger. With each passing moment, a reflection ghosting across the reinforced glass like a memory not yet formed. She was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years in service to humanity. Not as a conqueror, but as a bridge builder who believed that words could accomplish what weapons never could. Behind her, Ambassador Quan Murray finished reviewing the diplomatic protocols for the 3rd time that morning and set down her tablet with a soft exhale. "General, the Thixan delegation has already arrived," Murray said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she had learned during her years of training under Seojin herself. "They want us to know they were here first." Seojin replied without turning from the window, a slight smile crossing her weathered face as she recognized the political maneuvering for what it was. The Thixan Dominion had been a shadow over human expansion for 2 decades now, an insectoid species that viewed the universe through the lens of strength and domination, and could not understand why humanity refused to play by those ancient rules. They saw human diplomacy as weakness, and human compassion as a defect to be exploited, and every attempt at peace had foundered on the rocks of their contempt. But Seojin had ended 3 interstellar conflicts through patience and understanding, and she believed with every fiber of her being that the Thixan were no different from any other species she had brought to the negotiating table. "They will test us," she said, finally turning to face her former student, with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom and something that might have been hope. "They will insult us and provoke us and try to make us show them the monsters they believe we are hiding inside our soft exteriors," Murray nodded, having heard this lesson many times before during her years of study under the most respected diplomat humanity had ever produced. "And we will show them something else instead," she said, completing the thought as she had done so many times in training. "We will show them who we really are." The docking procedure took 20 minutes, and then they were walking through the gleaming corridors of the Concord station with their small security detail flanking them in crisp formation. Delegates from dozens of species watched them pass, some with curiosity and others with barely concealed concern, because everyone knew that the peace talks between humanity and the Thixan Dominion would shape the future of an entire galactic quadrant. The central plaza of the Concord station was a masterpiece of neutral architecture, designed by committee to offend no culture and welcome all. Its soaring ceilings and flowing water features creating a sense of openness that was meant to encourage honest discourse. High Prelate Vorath stood at the center of the plaza surrounded by his warrior guard. His chitinous body gleaming under the artificial lights, and his compound eyes tracking every movement in the vast space with predatory attention. He was tall even by Thixan standards. His exoskeleton scarred from ritual combat and decorated with the bones of enemies he had defeated in personal challenge. "The human comes," he announced to the assembled dignitaries, his translator rendering his clicking speech into something cold and sharp and dripping with disdain. "See how she walks without armor, without weapons, without even the dignity of a proper warrior escort." Seojin approached with measured steps, her posture relaxed but her attention fully engaged as she read the subtle signals in Vorath's body language and recognized the danger that others might have missed. "Hi, Prelate Vorath," she said with a respectful nod that cost her nothing to give, and might yet purchase everything she hoped to achieve. "I thank you for agreeing to these talks, and for traveling so far in the pursuit of peace between our peoples." Vorath made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, though there was no humor in the sharp clicks that echoed through the plaza. "Peace," he repeated as though the word itself was an insult. "You humans speak of peace as though it is something to be desired, rather than a surrender dressed in pleasant words." "Peace is not surrender," Seojin replied calmly, aware that hundreds of alien eyes were watching this exchange and that the next few moments might determine the fate of billions. "Peace is the recognition that we are stronger together than we are apart, that cooperation builds what conflict can only destroy." "Weakness speaks with a gentle tongue," Vorath said, and something changed in his posture that made Murray's blood run cold. "Your species has infected this galaxy with your soft ideas, and your pathetic belief that all creatures can simply choose to set aside their nature." He raised one clawed appendage, and suddenly Thixan soldiers were moving through the crowd with weapons drawn. Their movements synchronized with military precision as they surrounded the human delegation. "General," Murray said urgently. Reaching for the sidearm she carried more as tradition than actual protection. "No," Seojin said, her voice cutting through the rising panic like a blade through silk. "Stand down, all of you." The human security detail hesitated, their training warring with their instincts as Thixan warriors pressed closer with weapons humming and ready to fire. "This is neutral ground," one of the alien dignitaries shouted. A reptilian ambassador from a species whose name Murray could not recall in that moment of crystallizing terror. "You violate every law of the Concord. The Concord is weak, as all things touched by human philosophy become weak," Vorath declared, his voice rising to fill the plaza as his soldiers seized General Yoon and forced her to her knees. "Today, the galaxy will learn what happens to those who mistake softness for strength." They dragged Seojin to the center of the plaza where a metal frame had been erected during the night by Thixan workers who had claimed to be preparing ceremonial decorations. Now Murray understood what that frame was for, and the understanding hit her like a physical blow that drove the air from her lungs. "You cannot do this," she screamed, fighting against the soldiers who held her back as they bound General Yoon to the frame with metal restraints that bit into her flesh. "The whole galaxy is watching." "Yes," Vorath said, turning to face the cameras that broadcast across every inhabited world in known space. "Let them watch and let them learn and let them understand that humanity is not fit to sit among true warriors." He gestured, and flames erupted around the frame, climbing the metal and reaching for the woman who hung suspended above the plaza floor. Murray expected screaming and begging and all the things that Vorath clearly wanted to broadcast to the universe as proof of human weakness. Instead, General Yoon Sejin lifted her head and looked directly into the nearest camera with eyes that held no fear and no plea for mercy. "Remember who we are," she said, her voice steady even as the flames climbed higher and began to consume her. She held Marae's gaze across the distance, between them, and in that look was everything she had ever taught, and everything she had ever believed, and everything she was now entrusting to the student who would carry her legacy forward. The flames took her, and she did not scream, and the silence of her dying was louder than any cry could ever have been. Vorath watched with satisfaction as the fire did its work, certain that he had just broken humanity's spirit and proven once and for all that soft creatures had no place in a galaxy ruled by the strong. He did not understand what he had actually done. He did not know that on 100 human worlds, military commanders were receiving the same message through encrypted channels that had not been used since the darkest days of Earth's history. He did not realize that in trying to teach humanity a lesson about strength, he had reminded them of something far more dangerous. The flames died down, and the plaza fell silent. And Ambassador Quan Myray wiped the tears from her face and stood straight and tall as she had been taught. "Remember who we are," she whispered. And the words were not a farewell but a promise across human space. The response was already beginning to spread through every ship and every station and every colony world where human beings heard what had been done to the woman who had dedicated her life to peace. Condition absolute, no forgiveness, no negotiation, no end. 6 months into the blockade, the Thixan Dominion was dying not with the glory of battle, but with the quiet desperation of a species that had never learned how to bend. Ambassador Quan Myray sat in a small room on a neutral space station, watching the door and waiting for a contact that she had never expected to make. The intelligence had come through back channels that would have seemed impossible before the burning. Thixan officers who disagreed with their prelate, reaching out to the very humans they had been raised to despise when the door opened. The figure that entered was young by Thixan standards, his exoskeleton still carrying the lustrous sheen of recent maturity, and his compound eyes holding something that looked almost like shame. "Sub-Commander Vrax," Myray said, rising to greet him with a courtesy that cost her more than she would ever admit. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Vrax stood motionless for a long moment, his posture carrying the rigid formality of someone who had been trained from birth to view humans as lesser creatures unworthy of respect. "I was there," he said finally, the words clicking through his translator with an awkwardness that suggested he had never expected to speak them. "At the Concord station." When the prelate ordered the execution, Myray felt her hands clench beneath the table, but she kept her face carefully neutral, as she had been taught by the woman whose death this creature had witnessed. "I know," she said quietly. "Our intelligence identified every Thixan present that day." "I expected her to beg," Vrax continued, and something in his voice shifted toward a tone that Myray had never heard from a Thixan before. "I expected screaming and pleading and all the weakness that the prelate promised we would see." He moved to the chair across from her and sat down heavily, as though the weight of what he carried had become too much to bear standing. "She looked at me," he said, "not at the cameras or at the prelate or at the flames. She looked directly at me, and her eyes held no fear." Myray remembered those same eyes, remembered the lessons they had taught, and the wisdom they had shared, and the final message they had delivered in that moment of impossible courage. "What did you see?" she asked, genuinely curious despite her grief. "I saw someone who knew exactly what was happening and had chosen to face it on her own terms." Vrax replied, "I saw strength that had nothing to do with weapons or armor or the ability to inflict pain." He leaned forward, and his next words came out in a rush that suggested he had been holding them inside for 6 months. "I have studied human history since that day, and I have read about your wars and your atrocities and the terrible things your species has done to itself and others. But I have also read about something the prelate never told us, about humans who chose peace when they could have chosen revenge, about leaders who forgave enemies who had done unforgivable things. Myra felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of hatred that she had carried since watching her mentor die. General Yoon spent her life trying to prove that breaking cycles of violence was harder and braver than perpetuating them, she said. She believed that every species, even the Thixan, could learn to be better than their worst impulses. Can you still believe that? Vrax asked. After what we did to her? It was the question Myra had been asking herself every day for 6 months, lying awake in the darkness and wondering if the principles she had been taught could survive the weight of her grief. I have to believe it, she said finally, because if I do not, then she died for nothing. They talked for hours after that, moving from careful diplomacy to something that felt almost like understanding as the barriers between them began to crack and shift. Vrax explained the faction he represented. Younger officers who had grown up hearing stories of Thixan glory but had begun to question whether that glory was worth the cost it demanded. They did not want their species to die, but they also could not support a prelate who seemed determined to lead them into extinction rather than admit that he had made a mistake. We can take the capital, Vrax said as the conversation turned to practical matters. My faction controls enough military assets to neutralize the prelate's loyalist forces, but only if we move quickly before starvation destroys what remains of our social order. What do you want in return? Myra asked. Vrax was silent for a long moment, his compound eyes studying her with an intensity that suggested he was weighing his next words very carefully. Mercy, he said finally, not for the prelate, but for our people. We did not all support the execution, and many of us have spent these months watching our children go hungry while our leader rages about honor and refuses to accept any path that might save us. Myra nodded slowly, recognizing the shape of a negotiation that General Yoon would have recognized immediately. The blockade ends the moment Vareth is in custody, she said. Full humanitarian aid begins within 24 hours. And reconstruction assistance follows as soon as stable governance is established. And the prelate? Vrax pressed. What will happen to him? This was the moment Myra had been preparing for. The test of everything she believed and everything she had been taught. He will face trial before a joint tribunal, she said carefully. He will be confronted with evidence of his crimes, and he will be given the opportunity to defend his actions before representatives of every species affected by his decisions. She paused, making sure Vrax understood the significance of what she was about to say. But he will not be executed. Vrax's posture shifted with visible confusion. You will not kill him, he said, disbelief coloring his translated voice. After what he did. After he burned you, General, alive in front of the entire galaxy. You will let him live. General Yoon spent her life proving that breaking cycles of violence was the only way to build lasting peace. Myra replied, if we execute Vareth, we become what she fought against, and we prove to the galaxy that humans are no different from any other species that answers cruelty with cruelty. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting Vrax's compound gaze with an intensity that bridged the vast gulf between their species. He will live, Sub-Commander, and he will watch as his people rebuild under new leadership. And he will spend the rest of his life knowing that the soft and emotional humans he despised showed him a mercy he never would have shown us. That is a punishment far worse than death for someone like Vareth. On Allery Prime, Counselor Thyra Vanes observed the secret meeting through surveillance systems that Myra had almost certainly detected and chosen to ignore. She recorded her thoughts in her personal log, words that would eventually become required reading for every diplomatic student in the Allori educational system. I have watched empires rise and fall for 3,000 years. She spoke softly. And I have seen countless species reach the moment of absolute power over their enemies. always before. They have chosen destruction. Because destruction is easy and mercy is hard, and the satisfaction of revenge is so much simpler than the discipline of restraint. She paused, watching the holographic image of the human ambassador offering terms that defied everything. Tyra had expected. Today I watched a human choose differently. Not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to honor the memory of someone who believed that strength was measured in choices, rather than violence. I do not know if the Thixan will accept this offer, and I do not know if peace will survive, even if they do. But I know that I have never been more impressed or more frightened by any species in all my centuries of observation. The meeting ended with an agreement that would change the shape of Thixan society forever. But as Vrax prepared to return to his people and set the coup in motion, he paused at the door with a question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Why show us mercy?" he asked. "After everything we have done, why not simply let us destroy ourselves?" Myre smiled. And in that smile was an echo of the woman who had taught her everything. She knew about building bridges between enemies, because General Yoon believed that every species deserves a chance to be better than their worst moments. She said, "And because we are human, and this is who we choose to be." Vrax left to begin the uprising that would save his people. And Myre allowed herself a single moment of grief for the mentor she had lost before composing herself and returning to the work of building a future that would honor Seojin's memory. But across the galaxy, in a fortress on the Thixan homeworld, Voreth had discovered the conspiracy through informants who still believed in his vision of strength through dominance and in his rage. He made a decision that would force humanity to choose between their principles and their survival. The ancient planet killer weapon, dormant for 3 centuries, began powering up in the ice moon that had hidden it from the universe's memory. Its target coordinates were already set Earth. The promised date arrived with the precision of a heartbeat, and the human fleet emerged from faster than light. Travel at the exact coordinates they had transmitted 3 months before Admiral Park Junho stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and watched as thousands of vessels dropped out of hyperspace around him, each one taking its assigned position with the kind of perfect synchronization that should have been impossible for a fleet assembled from so many different origins. All ships reporting ready, Commander Shin Yuna announced from her station, her voice carrying the calm focus that had made her one of the most respected tactical minds in human space. The Thixan border fleet is holding position 12 light minutes ahead. Park studied the tactical display and counted the enemy vessels arrayed against them. A formidable force that would have given any conventional military commander pause. But this was not going to be a conventional engagement. "Open a channel to all ships," he ordered, and waited for the confirmation before speaking the words that would begin. "Operation Remembered Name. This is Admiral Park to all coalition forces," he said, his voice carrying across the vast distances between his scattered vessels. "Today we honor the memory of General Yoon Seijin by showing the galaxy what she taught us. That true strength is not measured in destruction, but in discipline. Not in rage, but in resolve." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle into the hearts of every human who heard them. No lethal force unless directly threatened. He continued, "We are not here to kill. We are here to remind the universe that humanity does not break, and humanity does not forget, and humanity does not become the monsters our enemies expect us to be." Commander Shin watched the tactical display as the human fleet began to move, spreading out across Thixan space in patterns that had been calculated and recalculated over 3 months of intense preparation. They were not advancing toward the enemy battle line. They were flowing around it, past it, through the gaps between defensive positions like water finding its way, through cracks in stone. "The Thixan fleet is repositioning," she reported as the enemy commanders realized what was happening and scrambled to respond. They are trying to intercept our advance elements. Let them chase shadows. Park replied calmly, "Our target is not their fleet. Our target is every trade route, every supply line, every connection between Thixan space and the rest of the galaxy, across the tactical display." Human vessels began taking up positions at the choke points that controlled all traffic in and out of Thixan territory. Each position was held by multiple ships working in perfect coordination. Their sensors and weapon systems linked into a seamless network that could track and intercept anything that tried to pass General Crix. Watched the human movements from his command vessel and felt a cold weight settling into his thorax as he began to understand what he was seeing. "They are not attacking," he said to High Prelate Varth, who had insisted on commanding the defense personally despite having no military experience beyond ritual combat. "They are blockading. Then we will break their blockade," Varth declared with the confidence of someone who had never faced an enemy capable of matching his aggression. "Send the war fleet to engage their primary formation." Crix hesitated, his tactical instincts screaming warnings that his political position forced him to ignore High Prelate. "Their fleet coordination is unlike anything I have seen. And if we commit our main force to a direct assault, we will leave our supply routes undefended." "Are you suggesting that Thixan warriors should cower before human cowards?" Voreth demanded, his compound eyes gleaming with an anger that allowed no room for strategic thinking. "Send the fleet, General, or I will find someone who will." The Thixan war fleet surged forward in the classic formation that had crushed a dozen species across 1,000 years of expansion. Their weapons charged, and their warriors eager for the battle they had been promised. The human response was not what anyone expected. Instead of meeting the assault with matching force, the human vessels simply moved, shifting their positions with fluid grace that kept them always just out of effective weapons range while maintaining their stranglehold on the trade routes. "They are not engaging," a Thixan commander reported with confusion evident in his clicking voice. "Every time we advance, they withdraw. But they never abandon their blockade positions on the Remembrance." Commander Shin coordinated the intricate dance with a focus that bordered on trance-like intensity. "Convoy detected attempting to run the blockade at Sector 7, she reported. "Freighter class. Minimal escort, carrying what appears to be agricultural supplies. Intercept and disable." Park ordered, "Remember the protocol." Human vessels converged on the convoy with surgical precision, their weapons targeting engines and navigation systems with accuracy that left the Thixan ships drifting helplessly, but completely intact boarding parties moved in. Not with weapons drawn, but with emergency supplies and evacuation equipment. "Attention Thixan vessels," the boarding commander broadcast. "Your ships have been disabled and your cargo is being seized. But you will not be harmed. Escape pods are being deployed for your safe return to Thixan space. And medical personnel are standing by if any of your crew require assistance." The Thixan crews watched in stunned silence as human soldiers moved through their ships, taking everything of value, but treating the Thixan themselves with a careful courtesy that made no sense within their understanding of how wars were supposed to work. "They should be killing us." One young Thixan officer whispered to his commander as they were guided toward the escape pods, "Why are they not killing us?" The commander had no answer, but the question would haunt him for the rest of his life. Back on the Thixan homeworld, reports of the blockade's effectiveness began filtering through military channels and from there into the general population. Food shipments that had been expected were not arriving. Medical supplies that were needed for hospitals across a dozen colony worlds were sitting in human cargo holds. Industrial materials that kept the Thixan economy functioning were being systematically intercepted and redistributed to neutral parties. "This is impossible," Voreth raged in his war chamber. Surrounded by advisors who were increasingly afraid to speak, they cannot sustain this level of coordination. They cannot maintain a blockade across our entire territory indefinitely. High Prelate, General Crick said carefully. Our intelligence indicates that every human faction has committed fully to this operation, and their supply lines are being supported by multiple neutral species who have chosen to assist them in exchange for trade concessions. He pulled up the economic projections that his analysts had been working on. Numbers that painted a picture of slow but inevitable collapse. At current rates of interception, our food reserves will be exhausted within 4 months, and our industrial capacity will begin failing within 6. Then we attack. Vorath declared, "We gather every ship we have, and we break through their lines by force. I have already attempted that." Crix replied quietly, 3 times our assault groups have engaged their formations, and 3 times they have simply withdrawn while maintaining the blockade. They are cowards. Vorath spat. They refuse to fight. No, Crix said. And something in his voice made Vorath pause. They are refusing to give us what we want. The honor of a warrior's death, the glory of battle, the chance to prove our superiority in combat. He met Vorath's compound eyes with a gaze that held decades of military experience and a growing certainty that they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. They are not trying to defeat us. High Prelate, they are trying to make us defeat ourselves. Admiral Park stood before the communications array and broadcast his message across all Thixan frequencies. Knowing that every warrior and every civilian in the Dominion would hear his words, "People of the Thixan Dominion," he said. General Yoon Seojin dedicated her life to the belief that every species deserves a chance at peace, even those who choose violence over understanding. We honor her belief by giving you a choice that she would have wanted you to have. His voice hardened, but did not lose its careful control. Surrender High Prelate Vorath for trial before a joint tribunal. And this blockade ends immediately, and full diplomatic and trade relations resume within 30 days. Refuse, and we will watch your civilization consume itself while we stand guard over its grave. The transmission ended, and across Thixan space, a species that had never known doubt began to feel something unfamiliar creeping into their warrior hearts on the homeworld. In the poorest districts where food was already becoming scarce, the first riots began. 3 weeks had passed since the burning, and the galaxy held its breath waiting for the storm that everyone knew must come. But the storm did not come. Instead, there was only silence. A vast and terrible quiet that spread across human space like a shroud drawn over the face of the dead. High Prelate Vorath stood in the war chamber of his flagship and studied the tactical displays that showed him nothing but empty space where human vessels should have been moving and fighting, and dying as all proper enemies did. "Where are they?" he demanded of his advisors, his clicking voice sharp with an irritation that was beginning to curdle into something that felt uncomfortably like doubt. 3 weeks since we taught them their place, and still they send no fleet against us. General Crix, the most experienced military commander in the Thixan Dominion, studied the same displays with compound eyes that had witnessed 100 campaigns across a dozen star systems. Their embassies have closed across every world in the Vaj Concord, he reported in a tone carefully stripped of any inflection that might be interpreted as criticism. Their merchant vessels have withdrawn from all ports, and their colonists on mixed worlds have evacuated to human-controlled space. They flee like prey animals, Vorath said with a dismissive gesture of his upper appendages. This is what I expected from such a weak and emotional species. But Crix was not so certain, because the patterns he was seeing did not match the behavior of a species in panicked retreat. This was something else. Something coordinated and deliberate and far more concerning than any military offensive would have been. Across the galaxy on the neutral world of Allery Prime, Councilor Theravanes paced the length of her private chambers and reviewed the intelligence reports that her agents had been gathering since the day of the execution. She was old even by the standards of her long-lived species, having witnessed the rise and fall of 3 galactic powers during her centuries of service to the Allori Federation. She had seen wars that burned entire star systems and peace treaties that lasted for generations. But she had never seen anything quite like what the humans were doing now. "They are not retreating," she said to her assistant, a young Allery named Theron, who had been assigned to monitor human activities for the past decade. "They are consolidating." Theron pulled up the communication intercepts that their codebreakers had managed to decrypt. Fragments of messages that painted a picture both fascinating and deeply troubling. Every human government has signed emergency cooperation protocols, he reported. Political factions that have been feuding for centuries have set aside their differences, and corporations that competed ruthlessly for market dominance are now sharing resources freely. Thyra stopped pacing and turned to face the holographic display that showed the borders of human space. Borders that had gone dark and silent and impenetrable in a way that defied all her expectations. "They are uniting," she said softly. "All of them. Every faction and every interest and every competing agenda. All of it set aside in the span of 3 weeks." She had studied humanity for most of her career and had written extensively about their curious combination of individual ambition and collective purpose. But she had never imagined they could achieve this level of coordination so quickly. "What does it mean?" Turin asked. And she could hear the fear beneath his professional composure. "It means that Varath has made a terrible mistake," Thyra replied. "He thought he was teaching them a lesson about strength. But instead, he has reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. In the depths of human space, far from any prying censors or diplomatic observers, Fleet Admiral Park Jonho stood on the bridge of the carrier, Remembrance, and watched as the largest human armada ever assembled continued to gather around him. Ships arrived by the hour from every corner of human civilization. Military vessels and converted freighters and private yachts that had been hastily equipped with whatever weapons their owners could find. Old enemies served side by side without complaint. And debts that had festered for generations were forgiven with a handshake and a nod of understanding. "Admiral," his communications officer reported. "Ambassador Quan is on a secure channel." Park nodded and stepped into his private office, where the holographic image of Myrae flickered to life with a clarity that belied the vast distance between them. She looked older than she had 3 weeks ago, as though the weight of what she had witnessed had carved new lines into her face and added steel to her spine. "The diplomatic preparations are complete," she said without preamble. "Every trade agreement humanity has ever signed contains provisions that allow for emergency suspension in cases of unprovoked aggression against our people. The Thixan will call it an act of war," Park observed. "Let them," Myrae replied. And there was something cold and patient in her voice that reminded him painfully of General Yoon. "They burned our general alive on galactic broadcast and called it a lesson in strength. So now we will teach them what strength really means." Park studied her image and saw the grief that lay beneath her controlled exterior, the rage that burned behind her careful words. He knew that same fire burned in his own heart, because he had known Seo Jin for 30 years, and had considered her not just a colleague, but a friend who had shown him that there were better ways to serve humanity than simply killing its enemies. "She would not want us to become monsters," he said quietly. "No." Myrae agreed. "She would not, and we will not give her that betrayal." She leaned closer to the camera, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We will not destroy them, Admiral, but we will make them understand what they have done. And we will make sure that no species ever believes that humanity can be broken by cruelty. On Allery Prime, Counselor Thera received a transmission from human space. The first direct communication since the darkness had fallen. It was brief and formal and addressed to all members of the Galactic Concord. And it sent a chill down her ancient spine. The United Human Coalition announces the immediate and indefinite economic and military isolation of the Thixan Dominion. The message read, all trade suspended. All diplomatic contact severed. All travel prohibited until such time as High Prelate Vorath is surrendered for trial before a joint tribunal of affected species. Thyra read the message 3 times, parsing each word for the meaning that lay beneath the diplomatic language. They were not declaring war. She realized with growing amazement, they were declaring something far worse. War would have given the Thixan what they wanted. A chance to prove their martial superiority in open combat against an enemy they believed to be soft and unprepared. But this was not war. This was erasure. A systematic and total cutoff that would starve the Thixan Dominion of the resources it needed to survive without ever giving them the honor of a proper battle. They mean to watch them die, Thurin whispered, horror coloring his voice. No, Thyra corrected him, understanding blooming in her mind like a dark flower. They mean to give them a choice. Surrender or collapse. Victory through submission or destruction through stubbornness. And either way, the humans never have to fire a shot in anger. She sat down heavily, feeling every one of her centuries pressing against her bones. I have lived a very long time, she said softly. And I have seen many terrible things, but I have never seen a species choose restraint at the moment when they had every justification for revenge. Theron looked at her with confusion written across his features. Is that not a good thing? He asked. Thora shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the star map that showed human space, glowing with quiet purpose. I do not know. Yet, she admitted, but I know that I have never been more frightened of any species than I am of humanity in this moment. A single transmission arrived at the Thixan war chamber that night, broadcast on frequencies that could not be blocked or jammed or ignored. It contained only coordinates and a date 3 months in the future, and beneath them 3 words that would echo through Thixan nightmares for generations to come. We are coming not for war, for reckoning.